Right. For everybody online, we are just about to do the Oli. He aloha no ka aina luvehi. He aloha no ka aina luvehi. Vehi he aloha unai. E kunawai ke kau ikahana. Aloha no ale o e ho mai ka mau o no mai ka I sai guys. Okay. So, Melina Maikako, this week we're welcoming Dr. Noelani Puniwai for the alumni series. Noelani is from Puna on Hawaii Island and is currently an assistant professor at Makakuokalani Center for Hawaiian Studies here at UH Manoa. On the academic side, Noelani has completed her bachelor's in marine science at UH Hilo, and then she got her master's in environmental science at Washington State, and then she completed her PhD here in the NREM department. Her research interests include coastal ecosystems, cultural geography, knowledge co-production, seascapes, and most importantly, fauna science. A lot of her experience is composed of just that, as well as aloha and malama aina, or kai, and student success through cultural, scientific, and indigenous lenses. Please give a big round of applause for Dr. Lisa.
Okay, we'll get going now. So aloha, thanks everyone for making it today. You know, it's gonna be hard for me to see all of you at the screen in the room. But I did want to really spend some time today talking to you guys a little bit about my journey. And the title of my talk is kind of a title, work in training, I guess you could say. But it's really speaking about acknowledging climate change. And how we bring our whole selves, our identities. And I'm talking to you guys know Hawaii, you know that we're an island community, we have change constant, right? We have flowing lava fields in my backyard, we have rocks that are being born. I take my kids to a beach that's younger than them, right? They saw that beach being born. Just think about those rocks in Puna right now are 5 years old. You know, they've only celebrated their 5th birthday. And we have mountains that rise 10,000 feet into the sky, right? All of these places that I talk about have their own stories. Some of those stories are young and some are old, and they're all changing together. Just like the people that I represent, my indigenous background, my Oiwi people have traveled from Kahiki here with their stories, and they're constantly creating new stories. So today I teach at the Kamakakuokalani Center for Hawaiian Studies. I'm in the Hawaiian Studies department there. And although I've trained in marine science and here in NREM, in natural resource management, I've grown to realize and grown to understand how my ancestral wisdom, the wisdom of my ancestors, is the knowledge that we need to respond to climate change. And that's the journey I've been on since I started my PhD here in NREM. It was a different conversation back then, but all of these things kind of build together. The title of my talk, I have that word restoration in there. Have you guys heard that term before? You guys familiar with Robin Wall Kimura's work? She's the one who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, very well-known book. I think the word restoration comes from her second book, The Moss. But she emphasizes in her work the importance of healing our relationships with the land and non-human relatives, and to restore the land. So all her work is in restoration, and a lot of us here in NREM is about restoration. But the restoration is a part of that, the restoration is a part of that restoration work that we all do, right? Return our stories to the land and to remember how to hear the stories the land has already been living and growing all this time. Can I go back to the screen and fix it? There, I think that works. I didn't realize it didn't move earlier. Not much, so. Okay, so this is a little plan, my plan today, to talk about my goals in restoration or in restoration. Is to strengthen our communities in the face of a changing climate. And to do this through the work of intimate relationships. To re-indigenize our science. I teach a lot of classes here in Hawaiian Studies on Hawaiian science, on Pono science. And in doing so, I try to acknowledge the sacred. And that's a little bit of difference with indigenous science versus other science techniques. And all of it is a part of reframing our narratives of climate change. And how do we speak about climate change to each other, to our students, to other communities, and being present while we do so. These three pois, these three circles are kind of what I'm going to walk you through today. When I talk about connecting to climate change, to me, that's the first part of trying to address climate change. It's the first part of trying to restore creation. How do we talk about climate change through our stories? And not just stories of hurt or of change, but realizing that stories are what feed us. Yeah, and so we're going to talk about the mo'olalos, the akua, and Pilina. These are like my three circle stories. Three things that I like to talk from. And why do we need to connect to climate change? I feel like we need to connect to climate change because it will reframe our narratives about how our climate is changing. The stories that are being told about our spaces need to be our stories. Yeah, you only care about the things that you're connected to. We need to be witness. Here I have pictures of my students in the field, an auntie in the field telling us stories about her special places. And it's through these stories, through these connections, through these narratives that we share together that create change, that create connection, that rewrite our intimate connections to places. And this has been important for many years. This is a quote that I used in my work in my PhD, talking about the importance of coastal seascapes. It's not an indigenous writer, but yet she knows the same thing. All the places that we're trying to connect, that we're trying to malama across the world, if it's a wilderness, it's something far in distance, it's some place that humans don't have connection with. Right? But once you have a story about a place, that's why we have movies, that's why we have documentaries, right? We're always trying to introduce spaces, give them names, share their stories. And so I wanted to share a few stories that I've been working on. This story here is one that I did for my PhD work, and it was me interviewing ocean users, people who are really connected to the landscape, who are connected and have observed same places over time and understanding and asking them about the observations that they've made. And if we're able to try and map these areas based on what they know, based on their stories. So this is an ongoing work, of course. One of the main takeaways that I did from this chapter in my work, though, was understanding that the people who have the most knowledge were the people it was hardest to understand their knowledge. Yeah, because if you think about it, if you're a super expert in physics, and you have someone who's a really big expert in genomics, doesn't mean they can talk to each other, right? Because their expertise are in so high, but they're in super different fields. And feel the same way as it comes with ocean expertise. Even though these people have a really high expertise of how the ocean moves in their backyard, for them to portray that, convey that, be able to explain it to someone else is a whole different language. But it doesn't mean that they don't have that expertise, right? And the people who have a more simpler view of it and whose mental models are simpler regarding these phenomena have an easier time explaining. Another story that I had the privilege of doing had to do with Kaehuiki Mano Pu'uloa. Kaehuiki is a shark that was born in Kia'au, near where I live now today. It's that bottom right corner on Hawaii Island. And this is like 100-page story written Makolala Hawaii, all in Hawaiian language. And Kaehuiki goes on travels. He goes around Hawaii Island, he goes to Maui, he has battles, he makes friends, he goes on a huaka'i, he goes to Kahiki, he comes back from Kahiki. He does all of these journeys and all of these interactions that he has. How can I understand that story if I've never been with a shark? If I've never journeyed with a shark? If I don't understand sharks the way my ancestors did, right? So we were lucky, we had a class at the University of Hawaii Hilo where we were able to go up to the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, to Kuaihilani, and actually spend time with a shark. And I think those are the experiences and those are the stories that I feel help us bridge the gap between understand our traditional stories and our modern stories. And knowing that you can't always just return to a past without having those experiences today. To really get to some of these ikekupuna, you have to share similar experiences. You have to expose yourself to these places. One of the most modern stories I wrote about was during the COVID pandemic, when I was lucky enough to get to stay home for 2 years and get to know my coastline a little better. And so this is my coastline in the top right in Puna. So all these pictures are of Puna, where I'm from. And we were challenged in the Value of Hawaii 3 book to write about a story about how the Aina is changing, or how the Aina is surviving during this time of change, right? We were talking about human change at that time, and we were trying to reflect on Aina change. And so a student co-wrote this paper with me, and we talked about how having this time to be in place really let us allow to get to know the akuas of our place, to get to know our Aina better. I haven't taken as much coastal walks as I did during that year. I went to the same tide pools with my kids. We got to explore together. And I reflect a lot about the change that's happened on my island. So the bottom right corner there, that's the lava flow in 2018 that expanded the coastline. It covered Waiwakai, a couple of tide pools at the same time. So I think the tide pools would have been like that here. And it extended and covered it and created new areas of hot heated lava flows. And that change is something that isn't scary. It's not something that's man-induced, and it's not something that man has an involvement, right? It's a natural process that happens. But it's interesting to see how people react to that change, right? The stories that were told. Some people told stories of devastation. Some people told stories about my whole life. I don't know what I'm going to do now. I lost this. What can we do here? And you heard other people telling stories of cleaning house to welcome Tutu into the house. It was her time to come through. This is what's happening. You hear stories of people who know the landscape, who know all these different areas, right? This picture here shows the different ahukua in Puna. And as you can see, it's not as you would expect a normal ahukua map like on Oahu looks like, right? The top of the mountain is back up here. And most of our ahupua'as don't extend inland. We have different stories for our landscape and how we move about it. Because of not just Pele, but because of the different stories of how we use that biocultural landscape. This is the story that started my journey into climate change. And it was a story of surfing in Honolulu. We happened upon this by chance. I was working with this community because I was trying to understand from the lifeguards and the surfers, their observations about the ocean. And what I didn't hear them say was climate change. When I did talk to people at this stage, this was about the mid-2000s. Yeah, mid to late 2000s, people weren't aware of climate change. It wasn't a normal word that people brought up in conversations. And I was working at this site, and all the data that I was looking at showed that there was major changes that was happening in this space. And I was like, how are all these major changes happening, and yet the people aren't feeling those changes? So that surf site I was showing you, Honolulu, has been surfed since the time of Hi'iaki Kapoliopele and her journeys to fetch Lohi'au from Kauai. One of our first major dramas, our major epic stories, Hi'iaka was surfing that site. So if we think of that site being surfed for centuries, we know the stories that have contained. And then when I look at the data here, these are the things that create surf quality. So surf quality is a really fancy scientific term. I love it because it has to do with social and biological indicators to create surf. So it might have, you know, if you think of a surf spot with a perfect breaking wave, but if it's in Antarctica, it's not the perfect surf spot, right? But if you think of the perfect surfing wave and it's in 80-degree water with places that you can drive to on a beach, that's good surf quality. So surf quality includes the physical and the sociological conditions. And so what I'm showing you here is more of the biological conditions, but when I map it, you can see that the stream flow and the rainfall in Kilo, and these are specific to this site at Honolulu, have been decreasing. Wave height and wind strength have been decreasing there, and those what creates our normal trade wind waves. The stream flow and rainfall creates a bank in the bar that the wave breaks on, because this is like a moving substrate. Sea level in Kilo has been rising over a foot over the last century. It's not due to climate change, it just has to do with our islands getting heavier because of all the lava that pushes down and makes us heavier. But nevertheless, it does mean that sea level rise has been quite significant in Hilo over the last century. And we also know on the bottom right that the direction that the waves are coming from and their intensity or the strength of those waves are also changing over time. And that's just because of the location of where all the storms are coming, right? So all of these things are telling me that over the last 30 years, surf quality has been declining. I interviewed 100 surfers in this project, of all ages, over 18 for IRB purposes, but from 18 to about ages 70. And I asked them 6 pages of questions. They were really awesome. If you catch surfers after a good surf session, they're pretty amenable to talking, especially if you have young students who are listening and ready to hear their stories, right? So this was a really fun time that we had. We also interviewed them at surf contests for kids, mostly the kids surf contests as families. And we did outreach at the same time with them, talking to them about the changes that we're seeing in Hawaii. So some of the larger reflections that we get from them when we ask them about how's the surf, we hear that surf was better in the past, that there were better surf conditions, there were more storms, certain places, had differences. But we also hear stories of no real change. Surf's still good. It's always awesome. Change is always happening. The graphs that you're showing me are sort of irrelevant if a big storm comes through and changes it, or if we have a really quiet season, right? All these little things, the shifting sandbar is a constant change. And so for surfers, change is constant. It's not something that they see affecting them in the larger sense. And their larger perspective is that it's always going to be amazing to go surf, right? So these surfers have grown up in place. They have a connection to place. They have a sense of place. This is their aina, their surf spot. And just as Hi'iaka surfed it before, they know they will always surf this spot, right? And so it's that connection, that pilina to change, which goes into the rest of my talk, that really stuck with me, right? It's not all the quantitative numbers that we hear about climate change that's the story that we want to hear. It's the story that we tell ourselves. If you grew up there surfing with your grandpa, like my daughter's 15 right now, she's been surfing there with her dad a lot lately, right? The stories she says are going to change. When she's 50, surfing with her kids or her grandkids, right? She's going to have different expectations out of that surf setting. And that's what we find with some of the older surfers. Maybe the surf has changed, but they don't want those huge storms on their shortboards like they did in their 20s, right? They don't mind these long waves with their longboards, with their grandkids. They don't mind the huge sandbar that exists there now that never existed when I was a kid, because now they can go have picnics on the beach when they're done surfing or while they're waiting, right? So the social interactions that people have with the site are just as important as the biophysical conditions of the site. And so I think surfing is a really good example of that. It showcases how people change with their environments. And if you change together, then it's your story together. So just like Kapoho, as I was telling the Puna story earlier, in Kapoho, I changed as that Aina's changed. And I didn't really go into detail earlier, but the Kapoho, the Waiapai tide pools, that is where I grew up. My grandmother had a house there, a beach house. That's the first place I got to learn how to snorkel and identify coral. And I got to take my kids there and do the same thing. So our stories change and our stories continue. This is one of the more recent stories that we hear, right? How many of you guys have heard of this story? 14 youths that have sued the Department of Transportation as they head to trial. So they'll be heading to trial next summer. Hopefully you guys stay involved with it. That on the right is my son. He's one of the few boys that's a plaintiff in this. I was, of course, pretty humbled by his wanting to be a part of a lawsuit and if he knew what that meant. So let's see if we're gonna try and hear from him. This was him when they went to the first lawsuit.
There's not one week, then let it rest, let it go back.
I'm not sure if you guys can maybe hear see this, but maybe we'll just listen to it just for a matter of time.
And I feel like
I'm
that.
sharing it with the Zoom crowd.
People are right for the state of Hawaii to fight against climate change, make it better. And I want my future generation to see how beautiful our resources are now. I want to use this day. Waiting for me, it just that it hurts my soul. And I want to know that Hawaii it's a beautiful place, and I want that to be seen in the future. I want people play a beautiful place. I want this place to grow away, die away. I want this place to be beautiful forever. Thank you.
Maybe you were able to hear some of that, but that was my son kind of sharing his story that he has with climate change. Just noticing that the Zoom video also says that the video is off. Should it be on or is it okay? Okay. Should I put it on? Okay. So my son is a pretty humble, quiet kid, and I was really amazed. The video was actually him standing at the podium and telling his story. And I'm excited for him, climate change is his reality, right? His generation is growing up with this completely surrounding them all the time. But given a chance to have the stage and say why it's important to you, has been interesting to see how he articulates that himself. He's a fisherman, he loves to fish, he loves to dive. And as he sees and hears the stories of everyone who's come before him, I think it hits him differently, right, than it hits us. I saw my kite in a time of abundance. I was lucky enough that that was part of my story. But his story is where all he hears is abundance that happened before him and the death that's coming after him, right? So he needs to create his own stories and how he's a part of that movement. Okay, so we're gonna wrap up pretty quickly here. Talking about some of our pilina and the first circle of Kua we didn't get to touch, so we're going to touch that one and pilina real quick. I wanted to bring up the story of Maui because now we're hearing new stories of climate change, right, and how that impacts us. This story is from the newspaper, 1867, talking about the reason of the famine, the reason of the drought in Lahaina, specifically about Lahaina. And you can see in his writing to the newspaper, he's not just blaming it on the landscape changes, but also the changes in the social ecological landscape, right? People's values and how people's values change. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about changing the narrative of climate change and not just talking about it as being a change of the Aina or of the world, but the change of people and how it's the change of people that's the root of all of this. And that's also how we can kind of change our stories going forward. Right? This is another story from 2012, 2014 when they put it out, right? These stories existed. And then the stories that I like to interact with now are the stories that are then going back and talking about the hua of these places, these sacred places, the stories that exist. As we talk about the restoration, when we retell the stories that the landscape used to have, like of Kiha Wahine, who was the mo'o that guarded the freshwater sites on Lahaina. Right, when we bring her back, she was taken from this site and taken abroad. And she's been abroad for a really long time. And the whole time she's been abroad, they haven't had freshwater abundance in Lahaina. Right? It can be consequential. It can be something that you don't think is related. But we understand that in the Hawaiian worldview, in our epistemology, Aina, Akua, and Kanaka are all together in this triad. It's not just Aina and Kanaka. And that Akua can mean something differently to everybody. But it's in this triad of Aina, Akua, and Kanaka that we create Pono. And that word Pono is a really important part. It's one of the most important values that I find in the Hawaiian culture. And we'll talk a little bit about what Pono means. But I think first we need to understand what the three different points mean, right? We know what Kanaka are. We are all Kanaka. We talk about Aina, and more people are learning that Aina is not just land. It's not the substrate beneath your feet, but it's that essence that feeds you, right? It's that idea of a place, that idea of not just a space, but the idea of a place. And I know people in NREM learn about what sense of place is versus what a space is, right? It's a geography kind of thing. And then Akua. Akua is one of those words. There's a lot of really good stuff out there from Auntie Pua Kanahele talking about it. There's a couple papers that Hikuhi Keli'io Kahailani. Auntie Hikuhi and Auntie Pua have written a lot about Akua and helping to redefine what it is for us today, right? So these Akua aren't things above. They're not supernatural beings that look down on it, but they are the actual environmental processes. They are the actual natural world that surrounds us. They're elemental properties. And what do I mean by that? I have a little graphical one here, just trying to examine what these Akuas mean when we talk about them. So our god Akua of Kanaloa is probably the easiest one to demonstrate. And how Kanaloa isn't the god of the ocean. He's not a Neptune. He doesn't carry a trident in his hand. He's not Aquaman. Kanaloa is the essence of the ocean. He's the environmental process that is the ocean. We gave the oceans energies, not the ocean itself, the ocean's energies, personal need. We created a relationship with the environment by giving them personal needs. So the process that has to do with birth and growth on the moon cycles has to do with Hina, right? So Hina isn't an essence that lives in the moon. Hina is the energy that the moon is directing. The moon changes and pulls water on her monthly cycle. We know that it changes how water is available in plants. We know how it changes how water is available in the ocean. We know that birth and growth, right? We have coral spawning, we have fish spawning, all these things are tied to the energies of the moon. That's the Hina processes we talk about. And then we can talk about that for all of these Akua. Laka is that transpo evaporation that happens, that cyclical female water energy that is exchanged between beings. That's a Laka water process. That's why she's the goddess of hula, because in hula, you are dancing about the Aina, and as you do so, you sweat and you are exchanging your energies with the landscape around you as you're talking about it. It's this whole intricate connection, and that's why Laka is present as a hula dancer, as you dance in the forest, right? Our Kane, we know Kane as fresh water and Kanaloa as salt water. Kane is also the sun. And you think of how is the sun and fresh water, those two environmental properties, both the same Akua. And it's because he is heat. Kane heats the ocean to evaporate water, to bring our trade winds and bring us all our trade winds, all the fresh water that comes from the clouds to us, not all of it, I should say some, the normal trade wind water that comes to our process comes to us because of the Kane cycle of the sun heating the earth. We have other rain processes from Ku process and Lono, all depending on how the energies of those weather systems are different. Those are the Kua energies that we're talking about. So when we talk about the Aina, we're talking about our Kuas in their personal essences as part of that. Uncle Danka Mikao talks a lot about this. He talks a lot about how we achieve Pono in today's society. He was from Molokai. And he has a really great demonstration about the love and respect between humans and the environment when all is flourishing is pono. If you call these things by their first names, if you recognize the essence of the akua in these things, then you're telling their mo'olalos. Then you have a different relationship with the aina. So we'll go into this Pina section now. So the words and names that we as humans give to those areas around us, in place names, in environmental names, in the wind names, in the rain names, right? That's how we build connections with them. That's how we bring the stories from the past into the future, right? And so I would say that my journey here in NREM, as I try to hit some of these points of being from NREM and what I take into the future, is building that pilina. Yeah, that's a picture of my son doing his first underwater transect in Kapoho, which no longer exists. We take kids on the canoes to learn how to do marine science. Not from a vessel where you're exposed, separated from the ocean, but from a va'a where you're actually feeling the currents and feeling the water temperature, understanding turbidity, being able to measure it in areas that are used, that are pili to you, right? Building that relationship with a moli. I have a different relationship with a moli because I met her and I saw her fledge her child, right? Those relationships you build change your stories. And it's also just as relevant to understand that the relationships you have are different, right? And each one of us has a different worldview. This is what started off my journey, I think, in bringing in Indigenous voices and Indigenous science into the research that I do. When I was a student here at NREM, I didn't study Indigenous science. And that was kind of on purpose. I was just really interested in management and making my aina flourish. And I wanted to bring in any sort of knowledges that helped me get there. And that's why I started talking with surfers. That's why I started talking with paddlers. I mean, all these people who I thought had the expertise in them, right? But I've learned through that experience that what he sees in the ocean is something I'm never gonna see. As much as he tries to tell me how to understand the currents, how to understand what the wind is doing and what the underwater is doing, I'm probably still never gonna be able to see the ocean the same way he is. And that's a good thing, but it's also something that we have to acknowledge that I don't have the taste buds that he does, or her tactile senses, right? We all experience the world differently, and we need to bring all those stories into the mix. Our data sets have to be robust. I think my final examples are about some of the projects I'm working on now. I've been working on limu for the last couple of years, even though I'm not a limu expert, and that's because these communities are asking for help. We have studied limu for a long time. We know how important limu is in Hawaii. We know how complex it is to study a species that is seasonal, right? How do you monitor limu when it dies back in the summer, when it comes back here, when it shifts, when it's patchy, right? All these things that make it hard to study limu is why we don't have good methods for monitoring limu. So that's what we've been doing here on Koho'olawe. We've gone twice to try and understand the limu resources that Koho'olawe has. And what the stories that the limu has told me is that for a long time, we've been blaming a lot of the decline of our resources on overharvesting. And that's one of the narratives that I'm trying to change when I talk about marine resource management. We've been blaming people's direct harvest. We've been blaming the fishermen for a long time. No one is harvesting the limu on Koho'olawe, and there still isn't limu on Koho'olawe, right? That is how much an impact sedimentation has on the reefs. It is an indirect human response, but it's not from overharvest, right? So we're trying to use and figure out what kind of methods can we help a community who wants to monitor their resources. Honau now, as part of the community-based assistance fishery management plan, wants to monitor limu. How do you allow a community to monitor species in a way that provides for its abundance? Yeah, a lot of those things are happening through the pack surveys that the Namaka Onauna gang is having. Similar things that they're doing with Opihi, because Opihi can be seen in the same way. We know from those graphs, from the John Cobb report back in 1900, that we had amazing fishery resources. If you guys haven't seen the Cobb report, it has amazing numbers for all of the fish that were caught back in 1900 in Hawaii across the statewide. And you can compare those numbers to today's numbers. And so we know that the pounds of resources of Opihi that we've been gathering goes up and down. But how is it that in 2010 we can pick almost as much limu as we did in 1955? Because it's not all about over harvesting. Yeah, there's all these other things that come into play. And we need to hear the whole story to understand how that works. Some of the work that the pack is showing is that OPE populations need to be harvested so that there is room for others to grow, so that the lemur resources can survive and then have new OPEs settle. If we're not picking all the big ones, then there's not going to be any habitat for the little ones to settle, right? These are those larger stories that when we change our perspective of where we're managing something, we can hear from that. This is kind of the slide that I always show. The management of resources is the management of our meaning and uses of these resources. And the relationships that we have is what this Indigenous epistemology, when I talk about Indigenous science, it really comes down to the relationships in play. I'm gonna kind of skip through these just so I can sum up. No, we have time for some questions. So hopefully you enjoyed my story today. Some stories from the past, some from the present, but all trying to reframe our narratives around science, climate change, and what Akua is and how Akua is a part of these processes. So hopefully you make a relationship with an Akua out there, get to know the wind that comes and visits you every day, right? Once you give it a name, then you know when it disappears. When we talk about climate change, that's the most thing that I want to stress the most is that the climate around you can be intimate to you, right? Just as your aina can be intimate to you. And if you change as well, as long as your climate changes, then that's a process that you go through together. Not saying it's not going to happen, but you're present for that story, right? And it changes that narrative. So I just want to put up a slide there of all those opportunities you have to get Pina with different environments, go volunteer at these different places, apply for experiences. This is something that I really stressed on my journey, was just applying and being a part of as many opportunities I could. The Sea Education Association, this is mostly for undergraduates, but they have a lot of opportunities to go out there and then help me spread the word. I'm still really involved in the PIPES program that's run out of UH Hilo. We have internships coming up next summer for undergraduates, and we're always looking for that next generation of Malama Aina warriors. And we've been changing our PIPES model to follow this Mo'oaina framework and using the huaka'i, the ka'au, the story of our students to help them and figure out their journeys. So this understanding of restoration and is just another way of saying your ka'au story. And I want you to join me on that. So I'll leave you with this last slide. My kids are like 12 years older than in here, but I love this quote from Kamali Kuwata. He had an amazing blog post that he wrote in 2018 during the 30-meter telescope activists, all that action that we had on the Mauna. And in his blog post, he was trying to say it's not science versus culture, right? It's not as simple as that, that we live in the future. We're not against progress. We're not against our future. We are going to be in our future. So come join us. And this va'a is a demonstration of that because it's made in a traditional style. This is the va'a that came from Aotearoa, but it also has solar panels and RF, the radio frequency, all those kind of things. It took water quality measurements across the Pacific as it sailed across, right? This is the future that I'm fighting for. So thank you, and I'll take any questions now. I can know.
So I'm not really from here, and could you maybe go into more detail about what your son did, what they were looking for?
Yeah, so the court case is still active right now. So Montana was the first state in the nation to actually win a climate change suit. And so they sued, youth of Montana sued Montana for not giving them a healthy ecosystem. So in the Hawaii State Constitution, which is based on kingdom law, let's see if I can put it here. So in Hawaii State Constitution, it says that everybody or Native, all the Hawaii citizens at the time were promised access to fresh water and living resources and everything they needed to do to survive. And so that is still part of our state constitution, and Montana and Hawaii kind of the only two states in the nation that have that in their state constitution, that their public citizens have a right to a healthy environment. And so both Montana and Hawaii sued the states to say that they're not being allowed that in the future. And so I'm not sure if I can make the other one sound, but so it's gone through court. Right now it's going through mediation. So in Hawaii specifically, they sued the Department of Transportation because they said the Department of Transportation doesn't have plans in place for us to meet our 20 by 30 climate goals. I think we're trying to be 100% on renewable energy by 2030. And now I think it's gone. I think they pushed that date back somehow. But either way, we don't have any plans in place to make that. We're not. One example is the new rental car center at the airport. You guys have seen they built that whole new building. They threw all the rental car companies in there, and there are no rechargeable stations in there. No recharging stations. So none of those car companies can buy electric vehicles because they have no place to charge their cars. Right, so that's the part of the planning that they're saying the Department of Transportation isn't planning for a safe and equitable future for our kids. I'm just a part of the conference cycle and stuff. So I think it gets into the legalese part of it, but understanding that the state promises us a healthy environment and yet they're not planning for that. Yeah, so in June, so as they go through mediation right now, we'll see what the Department of Transportation comes up with and how they're trying to meet the needs of the youth, and then if the mediation isn't successful, then they'll go to court in next summer. And yeah, so Montana just won their court case like a few months ago, and it was their first court case that got that far.
Cool. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And I'm not a lawyer, so it's really hard for me to talk about that stuff, but yeah, they have some neat stuff to look at. And I think let me see. Is that a question online at all?
No, I just invited folks to put a question in if they had. We don't have any online yet. I'm wondering if you can maybe briefly speak to the students about your journey, both going to Hilo, going to the continent for your master's, and then coming back to Hawaii for your PhD, and just a little bit about that process. And for many of them, they may not even have imagined being a university professor. Was that always a dream? How did you end up doing that as a local girl ending up then at the university, which is a rare story, right?
Yeah, it's never something that, unfortunately or fortunately, hopefully people are out there. I think I was lucky that when I was a young student in high school and intermediate, that we had a program called Puniwai that really tried to expose Native Hawaiians to go to college. And so I think college was always a part of my journey. And then I was really into the ocean and really into marine science. So I really didn't have a question that was going to marine science. And so then I started looking at all the programs that exist, and it was like, oh, Florida or Hawaii. So I stayed home. And so I think to me, that was a really amazing journey because it really helped me find those mentors that supported me. And that's one thing I always say is to find your mentors, and they can come from everywhere in life, right? They're not always your professors. They could be your auntie and your uncle. My uncle, who was a lobster diver his whole life, was probably my biggest mentor growing up because he understood the ocean in a way that I wanted to. And so I went through science to do that, and I still don't understand it the way he did, right? But I can't actually be the same type of lobster diver that he was. Like, he was just another level. But those mentors are really important. So I really enjoyed my time at UH Hilo. I did summer abroads. I did REUs as an undergraduate, so I got to travel. Went to a lot of conferences. Even as a grad student, go apply for those conferences. There's lots of funding to help you get out there and travel. And so when it came time to applying for graduate school, I think I knew from the start that I wanted to go to graduate school. There isn't much jobs in Hilo, especially in marine science back in the late 90s. And I knew graduate school would be one of those ways that I could probably get into some sort of management career. And so luckily for me, my undergraduate advisor that I'd worked a lot had went to Washington State University, and he had full funding. So hopefully a lot of you guys are in GRAs, and he offered me a GRA to move to Washington. And at that time, the GRA, I probably could have bought a house with my GRA funding. Nowadays, it's definitely not available. But housing in Washington and Oregon was pretty cheap back then. I really enjoyed my journey in Washington. I studied crinoids. You guys all know what crinoids are? Right? It has nothing to do with what I do right now in Hawaii. But I worked on submersibles and ROVs, and I was a big part of the early part of mapping in ArcGIS. So ArcGIS, when I first started, I had to carry like the sensor on my back with the frequency to just get my GPS to work. And then when I went to grad school, I did a lot of modeling and mapping of seafloor and benthic habitat substrates to model fishery as assemblage based on invertebrates assemblages. So I studied marine invertebrates. And that work gave me the skills that I needed to get a job. So I always tell students, like, yeah, you would never think that I would study crinoids as a part of my academic plan, but it's all the skills I learned along the way. I worked for NOAA. I worked for the Fishery Management Council when I was in Washington. I started being a contractor as a technical advisor because I was an expertise in marine invertebrates. I got to know ArcGIS and modeling and mapping, and all those skills is what brought me back to Hawaii. And so after I finished my master's, I had the choice, of course, to continue on to a PhD or to start working in the workforce. I knew I wasn't going to study crinoids for my life. I was offered a full PhD ride to go to Oregon State and to continue that work, but I turned it down to come back to Hawaii and start a mapping program that is it was like the first iteration of the Marine 30x30 Holomua plan, which hopefully some of you guys are a part of. But I did the first marine gap analysis for the state, trying to understand where marine protected areas should be put, or where are they missing, where are they lacking in protection throughout the state. And that job got me really understanding that we don't study that in marine science or in the schools. We have the questions that we want answered for management are always the questions that we can answer during grants in sciences. And so that really gave me the impetus to go to grad school. And I looked around a lot before I started my PhD program. So I looked on the mainland, but looking at here at Manoa, NREM was a very new program at that time. I talked to faculty in botany, I talked to faculty in JERF, I really looked around, and that was the infancy stage of NREM when they had these big visions and goals of really helping the management of Hawaii going forward. And so I'm excited to be a part of this program. I did lose 3 out of 4 of my faculty members in the department while I was in my PhD program. So turnover has always been a big thing at NREM, and it's because they were all young, just like me. I had 2 kids when I started my PhD. I had my 3rd kid in my last semester at my PhD, and Creighton has stories about her. She came to class with me every day. And now she's 15 and it's almost not quite as tall as him, but definitely taller than me. But I thought NREM's program and what they're trying to do with the program is really good. So I really enjoyed my experience, and I got to experience a lot of their faculty because of the turnover in all the faculty through the time. But they really helped me hone in my ideas. I tell students that a lot of graduate school, right? Anybody can go to graduate school. Anybody can get any of these degrees. You don't have to be smart enough to do it. You have to have the drive, and you have to have that understanding of what you're doing it for. So for me, I always wanted to protect Hawaii. The only narrative I heard growing up is that we're losing everything. And growing up in Puna, I see it every day. Rod is a big thing. The ohia in my yard have died. I see all the consequences of what's happening. And although I can't make a difference for every species here in Hawaii, I know working with students is the one way I can make the most difference. And so I think for me, I worked with the PIPES internship program for a long time. I worked with over 500 of them, I think, at this time. We turned 30 years next summer. It'll be our 30th year of an internship program. And so I thought I was always going to do that kind of stuff. I did a lot of reporting. I was doing a lot of contracting work. And I definitely wanted to stay in Hilo. I had moved back to Hilo after I took my courses here at NREM, and I wanted to raise my kids there. But through that time, someone called me up and told me about the position in Hawaiian Studies. And it's not something I ever thought I would do, being a professor. Again, I want to work with the Aina. I want to work with students because they have that passion and drive. And that's why they said I would be perfect in Hawaiian Studies. And I really enjoyed the ride there because in Hawaiian Studies, I get to work with students who have that same passion and drive for Hawaii that I have. And they just need the skills to make a difference, right? They need to learn all these different tools. They need to figure out different ways that they can make a difference in their Hawaii. And sometimes it's by learning a quantitative method. Sometimes it's by learning how to do a transect. Sometimes it's by learning to do an oli. Sometimes it's learning how to interview someone to help them learn the stories of that place, the names of the winds, the names of those rains, to understand if they still exist there today. What was the freshwater resources there? What are the different ways that you can find those stories? So I think being a faculty member is exciting because you're not just doing the research to do it, but you're also engaged and mentoring all of those around you. And so there's lots of different pathways out there, and I love helping students find those different pathways. And so far, I'm still excited for the journey that I am on here in Hawaiian Studies and as a professor. And I get to work with communities, and I think that's the one thing I've done is you make the job fit for you. So almost all my classes work with communities. Like I said, I make my students travel and experience these places together. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you so much.